The room was white in a way that felt intentional, not clean, not bright, but controlled. White walls, white floor, white ceiling flooded with clinical light so precise it erased shadows completely, as if nothing in the space was allowed to hide. 26 chairs had been arranged in a perfect semicircle. 25 of them faced inward. One stood alone at the center. Cameras were mounted at every angle, high corners, low eye level, even one directly overhead. No blind spots, no editing tricks. What happened here would be captured in full. A man stood near the edge of the room holding a digital tablet. He was in his early 50s, clean-shaven, wearing a gray suit that looked more corporate than religious. His expression was calm, professional, neutral by design. At exactly 3 p.m., he glanced at his watch. Then he looked up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly, his voice echoing slightly against the sterile walls, "welcome." The 25 people seated in the ark represented some of the sharpest secular minds in the country. Biologists, physicists, philosophers, psychologists, historians, former clergy, social activists. Many had published books. Several had debated on national television. A few were viral figures with millions of followers online. They hadn't come here to listen. They had come to dissect. "The topic today is simple," the moderator continued, "but eternal." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Does God exist?" A few smiles appeared, subtle, confident. This was familiar territory for them. "You," the moderator said, gesturing to the semicircle, "represent the strongest arguments modern atheism has to offer: science, reason, history, psychology." He then turned toward the empty chair at the center of the room. "And opposing you is one man." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the group. "He identifies as a Christian. Profession, carpenter. Age, 35. No academic degrees, no published works, no formal training in theology, philosophy, or science." A couple of eyebrows lifted. "He comes from a small town called Nazareth in Mexico." That earned a few exchanged glances. "Today," the moderator said, "it will be 25 of you versus him." He tapped his tablet once. The side door opened. The man who walked in did not look like anyone they expected. He was of average height, lean but strong in the way manual labor shapes a body over years. His jeans were worn. His boots carried the dust of job sites, not lecture halls. He wore a simple blue flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms. No jewelry, no symbols, nothing theatrical. His hair fell to his shoulders, dark and slightly wavy. A neatly kept beard framed a face that was calm, unnervingly calm. As he crossed the room, there was no hesitation in his step, no glance toward the cameras, no attempt to size up his opposition. He simply walked to the center chair and sat down. He folded his hands loosely in his lap and looked at the 25 faces in front of him. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no fear, only a quiet attentiveness, as if he were genuinely interested in what each of them had to say. "Good afternoon," he said softly. His accent was unmistakably Mexican, natural, unforced. "My name isn't important," he added after a moment. "You can call me the carpenter." A few people chuckled. The moderator nodded once, then addressed the room. "The rules are straightforward," he said. "Each participant may present one argument or question. The carpenter will respond. If you find the response satisfactory," he continued, "you will sit down and take no further part in the debate." A brief pause. "If not, you may ask one follow-up question. Then, your turn ends." The moderator looked around the semicircle. "Is that clear?" 25 heads nodded. The carpenter remained still. "Very well," the moderator said. "Let's begin." He gestured to the first chair on the left. A man in his early 40s stood up. He was bald, wearing a white lab coat he hadn't bothered to remove, a subtle signal of authority. His posture was confident, comfortable. "My name is Dr. Daniel Rivera," he said, "molecular biologist. 15 years in evolutionary genetics. He didn't look at the carpenter at first. Instead, he addressed the room. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "Evolution by natural selection explains the diversity of life on this planet. Fossil records, DNA, observable adaptation. Darwin eliminated the need for a creator." He pressed a control on his chair. A holographic display flickered to life, branching phylogenetic trees, genetic sequences, skulls of early hominids rotating slowly in the air. "This," he said firmly, "is science. We don't need God to explain where we came from." He finally turned toward the man in the center. The carpenter didn't look at the images. He looked directly at the biologist. "Dr. Rivera," he said calmly, "your work is impressive, truly." The biologist blinked, slightly thrown by the tone. "But may I ask you something?" the carpenter continued. "Of course," Dr. Rivera said, folding his arms. The carpenter leaned forward just a little. "Evolution explains how traits are passed on," he said. "But tell me, why do humans have consciousness?" A few heads tilted. "Not intelligence," the carpenter clarified. "Self-awareness, the ability to know that we know, to ask who we are, why we exist." Dr. Rivera frowned. "That's an emergent property of complex brains," he said quickly. "A byproduct." The carpenter smiled gently. "A byproduct," he repeated. "And morality?" The biologist hesitated. "Empathy evolved because cooperative groups survived better." The carpenter stood up slowly. Then he asked one final question, quiet, almost conversational. "Then why would a man donate a kidney to a child he has never met, in a country he will never visit, with whom he shares no genes, knowing it could shorten his own life?" The room went still. "That act," the carpenter said softly, "works against survival of the fittest." Dr. Rivera opened his mouth, then closed it. The hologram continued to rotate behind him. After a long moment, the biologist exhaled and sat down. 24 remained standing. The carpenter returned to his chair, unmoved, unrattled. As if this was only the beginning, the sound of the chair settling echoed louder than it should have. Dr. Rivera, the evolutionary biologist, remained seated, staring at the floor. His holographic diagrams slowly faded into nothing. 24 people were still standing, but something had shifted. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier had thinned, replaced by a careful alertness. Pens hovered above notebooks, eyes narrowed, shoulders straightened. The moderator cleared his throat. "Next," he said, gesturing 2 seats down. A woman stood. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a tailored gray dress. Her hair was cut short, precise. There was no hesitation in her movements, but there was tension in her jaw. "Dr. Elena Morales," she said, "philosopher, specialization, the problem of evil." Several heads turned. This was a heavyweight. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Evolution may not answer everything," she said, her voice controlled but sharp, "but suffering answers enough." She took a breath. "If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, why does he allow children to die of cancer?" No one moved. "Why rape?" she continued. "Why genocide? Why earthquakes that bury families alive?" Her eyes flicked toward the carpenter for the first time. "My younger sister died at 7 years old," she said quietly. "Leukemia." The word landed heavy. "I prayed every night. My parents prayed. Our church prayed." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "Nothing happened," she swallowed. "So tell me," she said, "where was your God?" The room held its breath. This wasn't an abstract argument anymore. This was a wound. The carpenter did not respond immediately. He stood up slowly, not to confront, but to close the distance. "Dr. Morales," he said softly, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss." There was no sermon in his tone, no attempt to explain pain away. "I won't insult your grief with easy answers," he continued. She nodded stiffly, arms crossed. "But may I ask you a question?" he said. She hesitated, then nodded once. "If there is no God," the carpenter said gently, "why do you call what happened to your sister evil?" Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He took another step forward. "If the universe is nothing but matter and energy, atoms colliding blindly, then your sister's death was not wrong." The word hung there. It was chemistry, biology, cells mutating incorrectly. He paused. No different than a lion killing a gazelle. A few people shifted uncomfortably. "Is that evil?" he asked. She opened her mouth, then stopped. "But it feels wrong," she said, more to herself than to him. "Exactly," the carpenter replied. He leaned in, not aggressively, but with intent. "It feels wrong because you know it should not have happened." Where did that knowledge come from? Silence. "If morality is just a social construct," he continued, "then evil is only whatever a society agrees to condemn." He straightened. "In Nazi Germany," he said calmly, "the Holocaust was culturally approved." Several people stiffened. "By your framework," he went on, "Hitler wasn't objectively evil, just culturally different." Her face drained of color. "No," she said quickly, "no, that was wrong, objectively wrong." The carpenter spread his hands. "How do you know?" he asked quietly. "If there is no God to define good and evil beyond human opinion, what makes your judgment superior to theirs?" Her lips trembled. I don't know," she whispered. Tears welled up despite her effort to control them. "I've never thought of it that way." The carpenter's voice softened. "The problem of suffering is real," he said. "It hurts. It shakes faith. But without God," he added, "you lose the very language needed to call suffering evil." He met her eyes. "The existence of evil doesn't disprove God. It points to Him." She covered her mouth as tears slipped free. After a long moment, she lowered herself back into her chair. 23 remained standing. The moderator shifted uncomfortably. "Next," he said. A large man rose from the opposite side of the ark. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered. Gray threaded through his beard. His hands were calloused, not from tools, but from years gripping a pulpit. "My name is Mark Sullivan," he said. "I was a Baptist pastor for 28 years. A murmur rippled through the room. "I preached every Sunday," Sullivan continued, "baptized hundreds, buried the dead, counseled the broken." He folded his arms tightly. "And then I discovered the Bible is full of contradictions." He looked straight at the carpenter. "Genesis 1 and 2 give different creation orders. The Gospels disagree about the resurrection. Paul contradicts James on faith and works." His voice hardened. "I gave my life to a book filled with errors." The carpenter nodded slowly. "I respect your pursuit of truth," he said, "but tell me, what specific contradiction broke your faith?" Sullivan didn't hesitate. "Genesis," he said. "Chapter 1 says plants came before humans. Chapter 2 says man came before plants. That's a direct contradiction." The carpenter smiled, just slightly. "Do you read Hebrew?" he asked. Sullivan blinked. "What?" "Hebrew," the carpenter repeated. "The original language." Sullivan hesitated. 2 semesters in seminary." The carpenter stepped closer. "Genesis 1," he said, "is Hebrew liturgical poetry, a structured hymn, 7 days, yom, which can mean a literal day or an era. It's not a lab report," he continued. "It's a declaration of order." He turned his attention back to Sullivan. "Genesis 2," he said, "is narrative prose, a zoom-in on day 6, a literary flashback." He quoted softly, "When the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, no shrub had yet appeared. Then He formed man." "It's not a contradiction," the carpenter said. "It's 2 genres, 2 purposes." Sullivan's eyes widened. "No one," he whispered, "no one ever explained that to me." "I know," the carpenter replied gently. "And that's a tragedy." Sullivan's shoulders began to shake. 30 years, he said hoarsely. "Wasted." The carpenter placed a hand on his shoulder. not wasted, he said. Prepared. The former pastor collapsed back into his chair, sobbing openly. 22 remained standing. The room felt different now, less like a debate, more like a reckoning. The carpenter returned to his seat at the center, still calm, still waiting. And for the first time, several of the standing atheists did not rush to raise their hands. The sobs hadn't stopped yet. Mark Sullivan, the former pastor, sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. No one tried to comfort him, not because they didn't care, but because no one quite knew what to do. This room had been designed for arguments, not confessions. The moderator cleared his throat again, though his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his tablet. Next, he said. A woman stood from the far right of the ark. She was tall, composed, and impeccably still, as if emotion itself were an inefficiency she had trained out of her system. Her black blazer hung sharply against her frame. Her eyes were cold, analytical. Dr. Elaine Chen, she said, quantum physicist, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Several heads turned. If there was anyone here who could reassert control, it was her. She didn't look at the crying man. She didn't look at the carpenter. She addressed the room. Miracles, she said flatly, violate the laws of physics. Her voice carried no malice, only certainty. Water does not become wine. Dead tissue does not regenerate. People do not rise from the dead. She folded her hands behind her back. These stories contradict thermodynamics, cellular biology, and every verified model we have of reality. Only then did she turn toward the carpenter. You may be skilled with words, she said, but the universe does not bend to belief. The carpenter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he tilted his head slightly. Dr. Chen, he said, are the laws of physics God? She frowned. Of course not, she replied. They describe how the universe behaves. Exactly, he said calmly. They describe. He took a step toward her. They do not command. A few people shifted. Tell me, he continued, if a programmer writes code that governs how a system operates, can the programmer alter that code? Yes, she said cautiously. And if an author writes a novel, he went on, can the author intervene in the story? She hesitated. Yes, he nodded. Then, if a creator exists outside the physical system, why would he be bound by the rules he created? She opened her mouth. She started. That's a logical trick. Is it? He asked. You study quantum mechanics, he said. You know particles behave in ways that defy classical logic. Superposition, entanglement, tunneling. Electrons passing through barriers they shouldn't be able to cross. He met her gaze. The universe already behaves in ways that once seemed impossible. The room was silent. But there is no empirical evidence of miracles, Dr. Chen pressed. None that can be verified. The carpenter smiled, just barely. Not yet, he said. Then he returned to his chair and said nothing more. The pause that followed was unsettling. Dr. Chen waited, clearly expecting something else. When nothing came, she sat down slowly, her expression unsettled for the first time. 21 remained standing. The moderator swallowed. Next, he said. A thin man in a black sweater stood. His movements were sharp, impatient. Julian Roth, he said. Philosopher, specialization, existentialism. He smirked. If God exists, Roth said, life has imposed meaning. If he doesn't, he continued, we are free to create our own. He spread his hands. I choose freedom. A few nods followed. The carpenter responded immediately. If the universe is an accident, he said, then any meaning you create is temporary fiction. Roth scoffed. So what? So, the carpenter continued, the sun will eventually explode. The universe will die a heat death. Everything you build, your books, your ideas, your freedom, will vanish. He leaned forward. You call that freedom? I call it a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. Roth's smile faded. I prefer an honest lie, he snapped. To slavery under a celestial tyrant. Tyrant, the carpenter repeated softly. He shook his head. A father who sets boundaries to protect his children is not a tyrant. He is love. Roth folded his arms. Then why hell? He demanded. Eternal punishment for disbelief? The carpenter didn't raise his voice. Hell is not a tantrum, he said. It is a choice. If God is perfect light, he continued, and someone spends a lifetime rejecting that light, what remains? Darkness? He paused. God doesn't force anyone to love him. But love without freedom is not love. Roth stared at the floor. After a long moment, he sat down. 20 remained standing. The room felt tighter now, the air heavier. The moderator glanced around, then nodded toward a woman with short hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She stood. Dr. Hannah Brooks, she said. Historian of ancient civilizations. Her tone was calm, but skeptical. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus supposedly lived, she said. They are religious propaganda. There is no contemporary evidence that Jesus even existed. The carpenter leaned back in his chair. Do you doubt the existence of Alexander the Great? He asked. She frowned. No. Why not? He asked. The earliest biographies of Alexander were written over 400 years after his death. He let that sit. The Gospels, he continued, were written within 30 to 60 years of Jesus' crucifixion. There are over 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Homer has fewer than 700. Plato has 7. Dr. Brooks's lips tightened. And secular sources, she asked. Tacitus, he said. Josephus. Pliny the Younger. All first-century references. She looked away. And if the resurrection was fabricated, he added, why did nearly every apostle die for it? People die for lies they believe, she said. Yes, he agreed, but not for lies they invented. She sat down without another word. 19. The moderator's neutrality was cracking. Next, he said quietly. A man in his mid-50s stood, face tight with irritation. Dr. Paul Meyer, he said, clinical psychologist. Religion, Meyer said, is a psychological projection. A cosmic father figure invented to soothe fear. Freud explained this a century ago. The carpenter smiled kindly. If that's true, he said, then your atheism is also a psychological projection. Meyer flushed. What? You grew up with an abusive father, the carpenter said gently. Alcoholic. Violent. The psychologist stiffened. According to Freud, the carpenter continued, you project that trauma onto the idea of God and reject him. He spread his hands. If belief in God is neurosis, he said, then disbelief is too. Meyer opened his mouth, then closed it. He sat down hard. 18. The room was no longer buzzing. It was watching. The carpenter looked around at the remaining faces. He spoke softly now. Reason can take you far, he said, farther than many think. But there are moments, he added, when reason reaches its limit. He paused. And then, he said quietly, something else must speak. The moderator shifted in his seat. Somewhere a camera whirred as it adjusted focus. And in the arc of standing skeptics, a thin man with pale skin and hollow eyes gripped the edge of his chair. He hadn't spoken yet. And no one noticed the slight tremor in his hands. Not yet. The room had grown quiet in a way no debate ever should, not the silence of politeness, not the silence of boredom. It was the kind of silence that settles after something irreversible has begun. The moderator glanced down at his tablet again. His hand hovered for a moment longer than necessary. Next, he said. A man stood near the far end of the arc. At first glance, he looked older than his age. He was exactly 50, but his body told a different story. His frame was thin, almost skeletal. His skin carried a faint yellow pallor. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, deep and permanent, like shadows that never lifted. He moved slowly, carefully. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if every word scraped against his throat. "My name is Dr. Michael Harris," he said. "Medical oncologist, 30 years in practice." Several heads turned immediately. This was different. "I've watched thousands of people die," he continued. "Children with leukemia, mothers with metastatic breast cancer, elderly patients with brain tumors." He paused to steady himself. "They all prayed." A few people shifted in their seats. "They prayed with faith," he said. "They prayed with desperation. They prayed with everything they had." His eyes lifted, locking onto the carpenter for the first time. "They died anyway." The room felt colder. "I'm an atheist," Dr. Harris said, "because I know what prayer doesn't do." He took a small step forward and nearly lost his balance. One of the cameras zoomed slightly, catching the tremor in his hands. "I was diagnosed 6 months ago," he said. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. A low murmur rippled through the room. "No surgery, no cure, median survival, 3 months. He exhaled shakily. "I'm in month 6. The moderator's face drained of color. "I live on morphine," Harris continued. "The pain never stops. It burns. It eats. It reminds you every second that your body is already leaving." He swallowed. "The scans show a 7-centimeter tumor in the tail of my pancreas. Liver metastases. Lymph node involvement." He gave a bitter half-smile. "I know the statistics because I've delivered them to patients my entire career." Then he looked straight at the carpenter. "And I know this," he said. "No God is going to heal me." The carpenter didn't interrupt. "So let's stop pretending," Harris continued. "Science can't save me. Prayer can't save me." He gestured vaguely around the room. "All that's left is waiting to die." The silence was absolute now. After a long moment, the carpenter stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, slowly. He took a single step toward the oncologist. "Would it change your heart," he asked quietly, "if you were healed?" Harris let out a short, humorless laugh. "Healed?" he repeated. "Here? Now?" He shook his head. "Pancreatic cancer doesn't just disappear," he said. "Spontaneous remission at stage 4 is less than 1 in 100,000. He raised his eyes again. "But yes," he said firmly, "if that happened, I would admit there is something beyond science." The carpenter nodded. "May I touch you?" he asked. A few gasps slipped through the room. Harris hesitated, then shrugged weakly. "Go ahead," he said. "Do your performance." The carpenter stepped closer. He placed his right hand gently on Harris's abdomen, exactly where the tumor had been documented. He closed his eyes. The room held its breath. "In the name of the Father," he said quietly, "and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." A beat. "Brother Michael," he whispered, "be healed." Nothing happened. 5 seconds passed. 10. Harris opened his mouth to speak, then froze. His eyes widened, his face drained of color. "What?" he gasped. He clutched his stomach. A sudden heat bloomed beneath the carpenter's hand, not painful, but intense, like a furnace igniting deep inside his body. Harris staggered backward. "Something's wrong," he said hoarsely. I need the bathroom." He turned abruptly and rushed toward the side door. The cameras followed. Inside the small tiled restroom, Harris collapsed to his knees in front of the toilet. He retched violently. What came out of him was not normal vomit. It was dark, thick, viscous. A foul metallic smell filled the air. The mass continued, 30 seconds of convulsing retches, until finally it stopped. Harris slumped forward, gasping for breath. Then he froze. The pain was gone. The constant burning agony that had consumed him for 6 months was gone. He pressed his palm against his abdomen. Nothing. "No," he whispered. The door burst open. Paramedics, on standby for liability reasons, rushed in with a portable ultrasound unit. "Dr. Harris," one of them said urgently, "are you conscious?" "Scan me," Harris demanded. "Now!" The gel was applied. The probe pressed against his abdomen. The paramedic stared at the screen. Her face went pale. "There's no mass," she said. Harris stared at her. "What?" "No tumor," she repeated. "No inflammation. The pancreas appears normal." "That's impossible," Harris shouted. "I had a CT scan 3 days ago." The paramedic turned the screen toward him. "It's gone." Harris looked down at his hands. They were shaking violently. The door opened again. The carpenter stood quietly in the doorway. Harris pushed himself to his feet, unsteady, disoriented, and walked back into the white room like a man waking from a coma. Every eye locked onto him. He crossed the floor slowly. Then, without warning, he fell to his knees in front of the carpenter. Sobs tore from his chest. "What did you do to me?" he cried. The carpenter knelt beside him. "Nothing," he said gently. "God healed you. I was only a channel." "But medically this can't," Harris gasped. "For humans," the carpenter replied softly, "this is impossible. But not for God." Harris clutched the carpenter's arm, weeping uncontrollably. "I didn't believe," he sobbed. "I mocked this. I mocked you." The carpenter lifted his face. "Stand up," he said kindly. "But I had no faith," Harris whispered. "You had enough," the carpenter said. "You said, 'If I'm healed, I'll believe.' That was enough." The room was no longer a debate chamber. It was something else entirely. The moderator sat down heavily, his tablet slipping from his hands. Around the ark, some stood frozen, some trembled, some were crying openly, and none of them could pretend any more that this was just an argument. No one spoke. The white room, once sharp, clinical, controlled, felt suddenly small, as if its walls had moved closer without anyone noticing. Dr. Michael Harris remained on his knees, still shaking, his hands clutching the carpenter's sleeve like a man afraid reality might snap back if he let go. Around them, 24 lives had stopped moving forward in time. The moderator was the first to break the paralysis. He tried to stand. His legs failed him. He sat back down hard, breathing through his nose, eyes locked on the man at the center of the room. "This," he said quietly, then stopped. His professional tone was gone. "This wasn't part of the program." No one laughed. A woman near the center of the ark, early 40s, glasses slipping down her nose, raised her hand slowly as if in a classroom she no longer recognized. "I don't have an argument," she said. Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. "I just have a question." The moderator nodded numbly. She turned toward the carpenter. "Who are you?" The room leaned in. The carpenter did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the ark, at the scientists gripping their notebooks, at the philosopher wiping tears from her face, at the oncologist still kneeling, alive when he shouldn't have been. "Does it matter who I am?" the carpenter asked gently. "Or does it matter whether what I said was true?" The woman swallowed. "Your arguments were solid," she admitted, "uncomfortably solid." A murmur of agreement followed. "But that," she gestured toward Harris, "that wasn't philosophy. That wasn't probability. That was impossible." The carpenter turned his eyes to Dr. Harris. "Doctor," he said softly, "tell them, is there a medical explanation?" Harris wiped his face with trembling hands. "I've practiced oncology for 3 decades, he said hoarsely. "I've published. I've reviewed peer-reviewed cases." He shook his head slowly. "There is no known mechanism for what just happened. No spontaneous remission of stage 4 pancreatic cancer occurs in minutes. Tumors do not dissolve. Necrotic tissue does not evacuate through vomiting." He looked up at the room. "This violates everything I know." A young man near the edge of the ark suddenly stood. He couldn't have been more than 27. Casual clothes, smartwatch, nervous energy vibrating through him. "I'm a software engineer," he said quickly. There has to be a rational explanation. His eyes darted. Misdiagnosis, faulty scan, placebo effect, something. Harris turned toward him. "I brought my records," he said. With unsteady hands, he pulled a tablet from the floor where it had fallen. He tapped the screen. CT images filled the air. "Scan from 3 days ago," Harris said. 7-centimeter mass, liver metastases, lymph nodes compromised. He swiped again. "And this," he said, nodding toward the paramedics' ultrasound still active, "was taken 30 minutes later. Clean, normal, empty." The engineer stared at the images, then slowly sat down. A man at the far end of the arc hadn't moved since the healing. He was older, late 40s, well-dressed, sharp eyes burning with anger and confusion. He stood abruptly. "This is a setup," he shouted, pointing at the carpenter. "Of course you won the debate. Of course you can perform miracles. You're not just a man." The room flinched. "That's not fair," he continued. "We came here for a human debate. Human against human." The carpenter met his gaze. "You asked for evidence," he said calmly. "I gave you reason." "You asked for logic," he continued. "I answered." "You asked for proof?" His voice did not rise. "I gave you that too." The man's jaw clenched. "I need this to make sense," he yelled. "This can't be happening." The carpenter took a step closer. "Say it," he said quietly. The man shook his head violently. "No," he whispered. "Say it," the carpenter repeated. "It's not madness." The man's voice cracked. "You can't be Jesus," he shouted at last. "Jesus died 2,000 years ago, or he never existed, or he was just a myth." The carpenter stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he rolled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt. The cameras zoomed in automatically. On his wrist, a round scar, deep, old, like a wound left by iron. He raised his other arm, another. The room gasped. "These marks are real," the carpenter said. "I was crucified under Pontius Pilate. I died, and I rose again." The man staggered backward, covering his face. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." The carpenter's voice was steady. "I came as a carpenter," he said, "because you demanded reason. No titles, no throne, no spectacle, just truth." He looked at the remaining skeptics. "I answered every objection. And when reason reached its limit," he added, "I showed you a sign." He gestured gently toward Dr. Harris. "Not to force belief," he said, "but to invite it." The militant atheist collapsed to his knees. "I spent 20 years mocking you," he sobbed. "I wrote books destroying faith." "How could you forgive me?" The carpenter knelt beside him. "I forgave you on the cross," he said softly, "when I said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.'" The man clutched him, shaking. "I'm so sorry." The carpenter held him. Silence wrapped the room again. Not clinical silence, reverent silence, the kind that comes when something holy steps too close to human pride. And still, a few remained standing, faces pale, minds racing, because the most terrifying question was no longer, "Does God exist?" It was this, "If he does, what will I do about it?" The room did not explode into applause. It didn't erupt into chaos. Instead, it fractured, quietly, along invisible lines. Truth has a way of doing that. Some people fall toward it. Some circle it carefully, and some run. The carpenter stood at the center, hands relaxed at his sides. He did not command the room. He did not chase anyone down. He simply waited. The first to move was a woman in her late 50s, an anthropologist with decades spent studying belief systems across cultures. Her shoulders sagged as if something heavy had finally been set down. "I've spent my life trying to prove all religions are essentially the same," she said, voice trembling. "Different symbols, same psychological needs." She looked at Dr. Harris, alive, healed, then back at the carpenter. "But this," she whispered, "this is not interchangeable." Her knees buckled. She walked forward slowly, deliberately, and knelt. "I don't understand everything," she said through tears, "but I can't deny what I've seen." The carpenter knelt with her. "I'm here," he said softly. Behind her a young man stood, early 30s, astrophysicist, brilliant, confident, until minutes ago. "I calculated the odds of fine-tuning my entire career," he said quietly. "I always said, coincidence." He shook his head. "But coincidences don't do this." He joined her on the floor. A journalist, mid-40s, sharp eyes dulled by grief, stepped forward next. "My husband died in an accident," she said. "I stopped believing that day." She looked up at the carpenter, tears spilling freely now. "If you're real," she asked, "can you forgive me?" He opened his arms. She collapsed into them, sobbing. Across the room, conversions rippled, one by one, not loud, not dramatic, just human. Knees touching white floor, hands covering faces, quiet prayers whispered for the first time in years. This was the first reaction. Surrender. But not everyone knelt. Near the far wall, two people remained standing, rigid, but not hostile. A man in his 50s, a chemist with decades of lab work behind him, rubbed his temples. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I saw something extraordinary. I heard arguments that shook me. But my mind isn't there yet." Beside him, a marine biologist nodded slowly. "I want to believe," she admitted, "but my training resists it." The carpenter walked toward them, not to confront, but to close the distance. "That's all right," he said gently. They looked up, surprised. "Doubt that seeks truth is not your enemy," he continued. "False certainty is." He met their eyes. "Thomas doubted until he touched my wounds," he said, "and I loved him still." He placed a hand over his heart. "Keep searching," he said. "Just don't close your heart." They exhaled, relieved, not pushed, not shamed. This was the second reaction, honest doubt. Then there was the third. A young man in his early 30s, viral atheist blogger, millions of followers, stood abruptly. Even now, his posture radiated defiance. "Even if I accept that you're real," he said sharply, "why should I follow you?" The room stilled again. "Your Bible supports slavery," he continued. "Violence, eternal punishment." He crossed his arms. "Even if you are God, how do I know you're good?" The carpenter did not recoil. He did not argue aggressively. "You judge what you have not studied deeply," he said calmly. "The Bible does not endorse slavery," he continued. "It regulates an existing institution, moving humanity toward dignity until hearts mature." He paused. "The Old Testament records judgment against cultures that burned infants alive," he said softly. "Justice, not cruelty. And hell," he added, "is not a trap. It is the result of rejecting love." He stepped back. "But I will not force you. Freedom is real," he said, "and you may walk away." The young man's jaw tightened. "Then I choose my freedom," he said. He turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a hollow sound. A single tear slid down the carpenter's face. "I know," he whispered, "and I still love him." The moderator finally stood, slowly, carefully. He looked around the room. Where once there were 25 confident skeptics, there were now people kneeling, people thinking, empty chairs. No one was untouched. The carpenter turned back to the room. "Truth does not compel love," he said. "It invites it. Evidence can confront the mind," he continued, "but the heart must choose." He paused. "And that choice," he said, "reveals who we truly are." The cameras kept rolling. The white room, once a laboratory for disbelief, had become something else, a crossroads, and every person inside it now understood. The debate was over, but the decision had only just begun. 6 months passed. The white room no longer existed, at least not in the way it once had. The footage from that day had been released without edits. No music, no filters, no commentary, just raw cameras, timestamps, and unbroken silence where silence had happened. Within 48 hours, the video crossed a number no one believed possible. 1 billion views, not because everyone believed it, but because no one could ignore it. Some called it staged. Others called it mass hysteria. A few demanded investigations, but many, quietly, watched it alone at night. Replaying the same moments again and again, the kneeling oncologist, the scars on the carpenter's wrists, the tear that fell when one man chose to walk away, and the question that lingered long after the screen went dark. What would I have done if I were there? Dr. Michael Harris did something no oncologist had ever done before. He published his case. Every scan, every lab result, every diagnosis, signed by 3 independent specialists. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, confirmed, terminal. Then, documented remission, complete. No chemotherapy, no surgery, no radiation. The paper went through peer review. 15 oncologists from different institutions examined it. Their conclusion was unanimous. There was no medical explanation. The journal didn't use the word miracle, but the doctors did. Dr. Harris resigned from his hospital position 3 months later. "I didn't lose my career," he said in a recorded interview. "I gained my life." He now travels quietly, speaking not about religion first, but about humility. Science is powerful, he tells medical students, but it is not God. The 7 who knelt that day did not become celebrities. They formed something smaller, a group that met in living rooms, coffee shops, church basements. They called it From Doubt to Light. The former militant atheist withdrew his books from circulation. "I was wrong," he said publicly, "and I don't want to profit from misleading others." He began writing again, not arguments this time, but confessions. The ex-pastor returned to Scripture, not as a weapon, but as a student. "At 52, he said, I'm finally learning who Jesus really is." The philosopher who lost her sister began speaking about suffering, not as proof against God, but as the place where God weeps with humanity. "I used to ask where God was," she said. "Now I know. He was on the cross." The 2 who asked for time kept their word. They searched, they read history, they studied philosophy, they spoke with believers who lived quietly, not loudly. One of them was baptized 4 months later. "I didn't wake up convinced," he said. "I woke up honest." The other is still searching, and the carpenter, wherever he is, has not rushed her. The blogger who chose freedom gained followers faster than ever. His numbers tripled. But in a private message leaked months later, he wrote, "I can't sleep anymore. I see his eyes when I close mine." Fame did not silence the memory. In a small town in Mexico, there is a carpentry shop. No sign, no schedule. No one officially works there. But locals swear that late at night sometimes a light appears inside, and the sound of wood being shaped, steady, patient, can be heard through the walls, as if someone is still preparing something. The carpenter's last words from that day are now quoted everywhere, but few hear them fully. "Faith is not the enemy of reason," he said. "It is the completion of it. Reason can bring you to the door," he continued, "but love requires you to step through." He did not force belief. He did not shame doubt. He invited. Because evidence alone has never been the true obstacle. The heart is. If Jesus stood in front of you, not with thunder, not with angels, but with truth, scars, and love, what would you do? Would you kneel? Would you ask for time? Or would you walk away, even knowing he is real? The people in that white room face that choice. So do you. If this story moved you, subscribe to Heaven Walks with Us. Comment, "I believe," if you're ready to take that step. Or, "I'm searching," if you're still on the journey. There is no pressure here, only truth, patience, and love. Because the carpenter is still walking, still knocking, still waiting. And maybe he walked into your life tonight.